The Old Testament can be intimidating ground for Christians. It's a bit of a haze of stories and history, and it isn't always chronological. You've probably heard of David slaying Goliath, Joseph being sold by his brothers because of his awesome cool jacket, Daniel getting thrown into the lion's den, Noah building an ark, and Jonah getting swallowed by a giant fish. But do you know in which order they happened? If our Old Testament history is rusty, we have a problem. In order to truly understand everything that Jesus does, we have to understand what his people have been through and the history of the culture that he stepped into. It's also essential to our understanding of the context of many OT stories. In this video, we're going to walk through a zoomed-out overview of the entire OT so that when we pick up the Bible and turn to Isaiah or Exodus or Nehemiah, you'll at least have a big-picture understanding of where the story fits into the grand scheme of things. We're going to tag all the major players along the road, but we're going to be moving pretty fast. But before we begin, I want to ask you to subscribe to my channel. Just click the button below the video and subscribe. And next to it, a bell icon will appear. It's very important that you activate this bell icon so that you receive all notifications whenever I upload a new video. I want to help you walk with God every day, so come and join me, okay? So let's go. It all begins with creation, in the Garden of Eden with Adam. God creates Adam and Eve and places them in authority over all creation. Deceived by Satan, Adam and Eve sin and are kicked out of the garden. They have a few sons, famously Cain and Abel. Over the next few generations, great corruption fills the earth and we meet Noah. Noah and his family build an ark, and they, along with the animals on board, survive the great flood which destroys everything else. Somewhere during this time is when scholars believe the story of Job takes place. We aren't entirely sure about the timing, but we do know that the lessons are universal, so the timing isn't really important. 10 generations after Noah, Abraham shows up. Abraham and his wife Sarah are promised that their descendants will be a great nation, that they will receive land, and they will receive God's blessing. Abraham and Sarah have Isaac even though they are ridiculously old. Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have Jacob and Esau. Jacob has a crush on Rachel, but gets tricked into marrying her sister Leah. He ends up marrying them both and having a bunch of kids. Somewhere in the midst of all this, God renames him Israel, and in a simplified way, his kids become what we know as the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph is the favorite of the children. The other kids weren't so fond of this favoritism and sell Joseph to slave traders in Egypt. Eventually, the whole family migrates to Egypt to survive a great famine in Palestine. The Israelites begin to grow in number in Egypt, becoming a threat to the Pharaoh, who enslaves them all. Moses turns up, the 10 plagues happen, and all the Israelites escape across the Red Sea. They head to Mount Sinai, receive the law, including the 10 Commandments, but they sin against God and end up wandering the desert for 40 years. During this time come the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses dies and Joshua picks up the reins and leads the Israelites back into the Promised Land. The land is divided up according to the 12 tribes. Next comes the period of the Judges. God appoints a series of leaders to help guide his people and lead them against the enemies that oppose them. The most well-known judges are Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, but there were actually many others. Ruth also appears during the time of the Judges, though she wasn't a judge or even Jewish. The people of Israel see that all the other nations have a king, and they plead with God to give them a king so they can be like everyone else. God allows it, and Saul becomes the first king of Israel. Israel is pleased, and Saul leads them reasonably well until they come against the Philistines. And of course, Goliath. In comes David, he who slays Goliath and wins the war on Israel's behalf. David ends up becoming the next king, and he wrote many of the Psalms. David was followed by his son Solomon, who wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. When Solomon dies, things get complicated. The kingdom split in two. For the next few centuries, there are two kingdoms that are a part of the story. There's the northern kingdom, known as Israel, comprised of 10 of the original tribes, which is led by Jeroboam, who was one of Solomon's commanders in the army. Then there's the southern kingdom, known as Judah, comprised of 2 of the original tribes, which is led by Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. Told you it was complicated. This is the period of time when the books we know of as the prophets begin. During the divided kingdom era, We have Isaiah, Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Nahum who prophesy to the southern kingdom, Judah, and Jonah, Hosea and Amos who prophesy to the northern kingdom, Israel. The prophets are sent to guide God's people and deliver his messages to the people. They give a whole lot of warnings, promising imminent destruction unless the people repent and follow God. The people don't repent. 722 BC, Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and all of the surrounding area all the way down to Egypt, leaving only Judah. They exiled all of the people of Israel and scattered them throughout their entire kingdom, replacing them with exiles from other areas of their spreading kingdom. The 10 northern tribes were completely wiped from history. The southern kingdom of Judah put up a good fight and survived the Assyrians, but failed to serve God fully. The Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, rose up and wiped out the Assyrian Empire and, over the course of about 20 years, conquered and deported all of Jews from the southern kingdom of Judah to Babylon. The prophets Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, who wrote Lamentations, all prophesied around this time. For about 50 years, the Jews stayed in Babylon under the Babylonian exile. Then came Persia. The Persians conquered the Babylonians and all their land. And in 538 BC, King Cyrus made a decree that all the Jews could go back home. In 3 waves led by Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah respectively, the Jews went back to Israel and rebuilt Jerusalem and the temple. Haggai, Zechariah, and probably Joel prophesied during this time. We know that some of the Jews didn't return home because the story of Esther takes place in Persia after the 3 waves of returning exiles. The last we hear about Israel in the Old Testament is from Malachi, about 450 years BC. Malachi calls God's people to return to covenantal faithfulness and await his coming. During the 450-ish years between the Old and New Testament, power changes hands a number of times. Persia remains in power up until 330 BC, when Alexander the Great, aka the Greek Empire, takes over the known world in 7 years. He dies young, and the empire crumbles in certain areas. While the Greek influence remains strong, the area of Palestine is ruled intermittently by Syria and Egypt. Under the Maccabees, the Jews established a wobbly independence in the land for about a century, and in 63 BC Jerusalem fell to the Roman Empire, which conquered pretty much everything. Rome maintained power in Palestine all the way up until Jesus was born, and in comes the New Testament. So there you have it, an overview of the entire OT. Now hopefully as you read through the OT, you'll have at least a decent handle on where you find yourself in the story of God's people. And now, I ask you to share this message. May God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.